September 1939. The rain hammered against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital in London as Margaret Walsh fastened her white apron and adjusted her nurse's aide cap. At 23, she had volunteered the moment war was declared, driven by a need she couldn't quite explain. She'd grown up in a Catholic orphanage in Sussex, never knowing her parents, and the war seemed to offer purpose where her life had previously offered only questions. "New girl," a cheerful voice broke through her thoughts. A petite woman with auburn hair and freckles extended her hand. "I'm Dorothy Chun." "Well, Chun's my married name. Dorothy Morrison before that." "Welcome to the chaos." Margaret shook her hand warmly. "Margaret Walsh." "Thank you. I'm a bit nervous, honestly." "Don't be. Sister Matthews is strict but fair, and the doctors are too busy to notice if you make small mistakes at first." Dorothy's eyes crinkled with kindness. She'd been at St. Mary's for 2 years, having also grown up without family, raised by her grandmother, who'd passed away shortly after Dorothy's wedding to a Royal Navy officer now stationed somewhere in the North Atlantic. As they walked through the corridors together, Dorothy explained the routines, the supply closets, the personalities of the various nurses and doctors. Margaret felt immediately at ease with her, as if they'd known each other for years rather than minutes. Within days, Margaret had settled into the rhythm of hospital life. The work was exhausting, 12-hour shifts that often stretched longer, endless bedpans and bandages, the constant smell of disinfectant and suffering. But she was good at it. Her hands were steady, her manner calm, and patients responded to her gentle efficiency. 2 weeks into her position, Margaret was restocking supplies in the basement when she encountered another nurse's aide she hadn't met yet. The woman was tall and blonde, with striking blue eyes that seemed somehow familiar, though Margaret was certain they'd never met. "You must be Margaret," the woman said, her accent clearly educated, different from Margaret's working-class Sussex tones. "I'm Elizabeth Hartwell. I work primarily on the surgical ward." "Pleased to meet you," Margaret replied, noting Elizabeth's confident bearing. Later, she learned that Elizabeth had given up a privileged life in Kensington to volunteer, much to her wealthy father's dismay. Like Margaret and Dorothy, Elizabeth had been raised apart from her mother, who died when she was an infant, leaving her to be raised by a succession of nannies and boarding schools. The three women's paths crossed occasionally over the following weeks, but it was the first air raid that truly brought them together. When the sirens wailed on a cold October night, they found themselves shepherding patients to the basement shelter, working in synchronized efficiency despite never having trained together. "You take the left side," Elizabeth commanded, her natural authority emerging. "Dorothy, help me with Mr. Patterson. Margaret, bring the medicine card." They worked through the night as bombs fell across London, the building shaking with each nearby explosion. Between the chaos of caring for terrified patients and the steady stream of new casualties brought in from the streets, the three women moved like parts of a single organism, anticipating each other's needs, supporting where support was required. When dawn finally broke and the all-clear sounded, they collapsed together in the staff room, too exhausted to move. "We make quite a team," Dorothy said, managing a tired smile. Elizabeth nodded. "We should request to work together more often. We're more effective this way." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of belonging she'd never experienced. "Agreed. It felt like we were meant to work together." None of them could have known how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that the connection they felt was written in their very blood. The truth of their shared origin lay buried in sealed records at an adoption agency in Brighton, a secret that would remain hidden even as they saved hundreds of lives side by side. Three sisters whose fate had separated and war had reunited, without any of them ever knowing why they fit together so perfectly. Winter of Fire. The winter of 1940 transformed London into a landscape of devastation and defiance. The Blitz had begun in earnest, and St. Mary's Hospital became a battlefield of a different kind, where the war against death was waged nightly. Margaret had learned to sleep through anything. The wail of sirens had become as common as birdsong. But tonight, something pulled her from her narrow bed in the nurse's dormitory. She couldn't explain the urgency that gripped her heart, only that she needed to get to the hospital immediately, though her shift wasn't due to start for another 3 hours. She dressed quickly in the dark, careful not to wake the other women sleeping around her, and hurried through the blackout streets. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that preceded horror. Elizabeth was already at the hospital, which surprised Margaret. "Couldn't sleep," Elizabeth explained, though her usual composure seemed shaken. "I had the strangest feeling that I needed to be here." Before Margaret could respond, Dorothy burst through the doors, breathless. "Thank God you're both here. I don't know why, but I—" The rest of her words were swallowed by the sudden scream of air raid sirens, followed almost immediately by the whistle of falling bombs. The attack was closer than any before, and within minutes, the casualties began to arrive in waves. The next 8 hours blurred into a nightmarish kaleidoscope of blood, screams, and desperate efficiency. The three women worked without pause, their movements coordinated with an almost supernatural precision. When Margaret needed supplies, Dorothy was already there with them. When Elizabeth called for assistance, Margaret and Dorothy appeared at her side before she finished speaking. Bleeding in bed 7, Elizabeth shouted over the chaos. Margaret was there in seconds with pressure bandages while Dorothy prepared 4-line. They worked on the young soldier with focused intensity, their 6 hands moving in perfect synchronization, each knowing instinctively what the others would do next. Dr. Harrison, the senior surgeon, paused mid-suture to watch them. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "It's as if they share one mind." Sister Matthews, the head nurse, had noticed it too. Over the past months, she'd observed these 3 young women with growing fascination. They developed an almost telepathic connection, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating needs before they were voiced, working together with an efficiency that exceeded anything she'd seen in her 30 years of nursing. As dawn broke over a burning London, they'd saved 43 lives that night. The toll could have been twice that without their coordinated efforts. In the brief lull before the day's shift arrived, the 3 women sat together in the supply room, too wired from adrenaline to rest despite their exhaustion. "How do we do that?" Dorothy asked, her hand still trembling slightly. "It's like I know what you're both going to do before you do it." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I felt it too, from the very beginning. It's as if we're connected somehow." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. "I never had a family," she said quietly. "Growing up in the orphanage, I used to imagine I had sisters somewhere, that maybe they felt as lost as I did." Dorothy's breath caught. "I grew up with my grandmother, but my mother died when I was born. I never knew anything about her family." Elizabeth's face had gone pale. "My mother died in childbirth as well. My father never spoke of her. He sent me away to school when I was 6. The 3 women stared at each other, a strange recognition dawning in their eyes, though none of them could have articulated what they sensed. "When were you born?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. "March 15th, 1916, Margaret replied. Dorothy's cup clattered to the floor. "That's my birthday, too." Elizabeth stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "That's impossible. That's my birthday as well." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the hospital awakening to another day. Secrets in the archives. The revelation of their shared birthday haunted the 3 women through the following weeks. They tried to dismiss it as an extraordinary coincidence. London was a city of millions, after all, but the connection they felt couldn't be explained away so easily. It was Dorothy who finally suggested they investigate. "My grandmother mentioned once that I had been adopted through an agency in Brighton," she said during one of their rare breaks. She was very old and confused near the end, but she seemed troubled by it, as if there was something she wanted to tell me, but couldn't. Margaret's heart raced. "I was told I was from Brighton, too. The nuns said my mother couldn't keep me, but they never explained why." Elizabeth's usual reserve crumbled. "My father told me my mother died giving birth to me at a private hospital in Brighton, but he's always been evasive about the details. He destroyed all photographs of her, said it was too painful to keep them." That Saturday, their day off, they took the train to Brighton. The journey felt surreal, each woman lost in her own thoughts, afraid to voice the possibility that was taking shape in their minds. The Brighton Adoption Society was housed in a narrow Victorian building near the seafront. The receptionist, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, regarded them with immediate suspicion. "We're looking for records from March 1916, Elizabeth explained, using her most authoritative voice. "We believe we may have been adopted through this agency." "Records are confidential," the woman replied curtly. "We don't release information to anyone." Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Please, we only want to know the truth about where we came from. We're not trying to cause trouble for anyone." Something in Margaret's tone must have touched the woman, because her expression softened slightly. "What are your names?" They gave them, and the woman disappeared into a back room. They waited in anxious silence for nearly 20 minutes before she returned, carrying a dusty file box. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said quietly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "But I've worked here 40 years, and I remember that case. It was tragic. 3 beautiful baby girls, all born on the same day to the same mother. She was unmarried, quite young, from a good family. They hushed it up, of course." The room seemed to spin. Dorothy gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. "Triplets." Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. The woman nodded. "The family insisted they be separated. They thought it would be easier to hide the scandal that way, and they believed the girls would have better lives apart. The mother died a few days after the birth. Complications, they said, though I always wondered if it was grief. She'd begged to keep at least one of you, I was told, but her family refused." She opened the file, revealing 3 identical birth certificates. The mother's name was listed as Catherine Hartwell. Elizabeth swayed, and Margaret caught her arm. "Hartwell," Elizabeth whispered. "That's my surname." "That means your father lied to you," the woman said gently. "Catherine Hartwell was his younger sister, not his wife. You're his niece, not his daughter. He took you in to save the family name, but he separated you from your sisters to protect the secret." The implications crashed over them in waves. They weren't just connected by some mysterious bond. They were sisters, triplets, separated at birth by family shame and social convention. "Why?" Dorothy asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why would they do this to us?" The woman shook her head sadly. This was 1916. An unmarried mother, especially from a wealthy family, brought unbearable shame. They thought they were doing what was best. They never imagined what they were really doing was tearing apart 3 souls who belonged together. Margaret, who had spent 23 years wondering who she was, felt something inside her shift and settle into place. She reached out and took Dorothy's hand, then Elizabeth's. The 3 of them stood there, connected at last by more than intuition and shared purpose. A fractured truth. The train ride back to London passed in stunned silence. Each woman struggled to process the revelation that had upended everything they thought they knew about themselves. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks provided a steady backdrop to their turbulent thoughts. Elizabeth stared out the window at the darkening countryside, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She'd spent her entire life believing she was Robert Hartwell's daughter, the cherished only child of a distant but respectable father. Now she understood why he'd always seemed uncomfortable around her, why he'd sent her away to boarding school so young, why he'd never remarried or kept any pictures of her supposed mother. "He must have hated me," she said finally, her voice hollow, a constant reminder of his sister's shame. "Don't," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever his reasons, whatever his feelings, you're not responsible for the circumstances of your birth. None of us are." Dorothy wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "I keep thinking about my grandmother. She was so kind to me, but she must have known. All those years, she knew I had sisters somewhere, and she never told me. Perhaps she wanted to," Margaret suggested. "Perhaps she was bound by promises she'd made, or feared what the truth might do to you. Or perhaps," Elizabeth said bitterly, "everyone decided it was easier to pretend. Easier to scatter us to the winds than to acknowledge what had been done." The conversation lapsed again. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and soon they'd be back in London, back to the hospital, back to saving lives while their own had been fundamentally altered. It was Margaret who finally voiced what they were all thinking. We have to decide what to do with this knowledge. Do we confront those who kept this from us? Do we tell anyone? What's the point? Elizabeth's laugh was harsh. Our mother is dead. My father, my uncle, has made his choices clear. Dorothy's grandmother is gone. Who is left to confront? Each other, Dorothy said quietly. We have each other now. Isn't that what matters? Margaret felt tears threatening again. She'd cried more in the past 12 hours than she had in her entire adult life. I spent my whole life feeling incomplete, like something essential was missing. I used to have these dreams about two other girls. We were running through a garden together, laughing. I always woke up feeling bereft, like I'd lost something precious I couldn't name. Elizabeth turned from the window, her blue eyes, their mother's eyes, Margaret now realized, bright with unshed tears. I had similar dreams. 3 little girls in matching white dresses. I thought they were just the product of a lonely child's imagination. We were together once, Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion, before they separated us. Perhaps some part of us remembered, even as infants. Perhaps that's why we've always felt this connection. The train pulled into Victoria Station, and they gathered their things mechanically. The platform was crowded with soldiers and civilians, everyone moving with the purposeful urgency that characterized wartime London. As they emerged onto the street, air raid sirens began their mournful wail. People hurried toward the nearest shelter, but the 3 women stood still, looking at each other in the eerie light of the setting sun. We can't change the past, Margaret said, but we can choose how we move forward. We're sisters. That's the truth that matters now. Elizabeth nodded slowly, some of her characteristic composure returning. Agreed. And we're also nurses' aides at St. Mary's Hospital, where people need us. Whatever personal crisis we're experiencing, there's still a war to be fought, still lives to be saved. Together, Dorothy added, taking each of their hands. From now on, we do everything together. No more secrets, no more separation. They walked through the darkening streets towards St. Mary's. 3 women who had been scattered by shame and reunited by war, bound now by blood and choice and an unbreakable determination to save as many lives as they could. When they arrived at the hospital, Sister Matthews took one look at their faces and knew something had changed. But she was wise enough not to ask, simply nodding them toward their stations as the first casualties from the night's raid began to arrive. The 3 sisters moved into position, their movements as synchronized as ever, but now with a deeper understanding of why they fit together so perfectly. They weren't just 3 women who worked well together. They were 3 parts of a whole, finally reunited, and nothing would separate them again. The underground hospital. By spring of 1941, the Blitz had transformed St. Mary's into something barely recognizable. The upper floors had taken direct hits twice, and much of the hospital's operations had moved into the reinforced basement and connected underground tunnels. The sisters, for they now thought of themselves that way, though they kept the truth private, had become legends among the staff and patients. Dr. Harrison had begun calling them the Trinity, and the name stuck. When the Trinity was on duty, survival rates mysteriously improved. They seemed to know where they were needed before anyone called for them, could assess a patient's condition with uncanny accuracy, and worked with a speed and precision that bordered on miraculous. What no one knew was how the discovery of their connection had deepened their already extraordinary bond. They'd moved into a small flat together, sharing expenses and what little free time they had. In the quiet hours before dawn, they'd pieced together fragments of their shared mother's story, imagining who Catherine Hartwell had been, mourning the woman they'd never known. She was only 17 when she had us, Elizabeth had discovered, going through old society papers in the library. 17, unmarried, and pregnant with triplets in 1916. She must have been terrified. They found a single photograph, tucked away in an old newspaper announcement of Robert Hartwell's sister's tragic death from influenza. The picture showed a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. Each of them could see themselves in her features. Margaret had her eyes, Dorothy her smile, Elizabeth her bone structure. Tonight, The hospital was overwhelmed. A bombing raid had struck a crowded shelter in Bethnal Green, and the casualties were catastrophic. The Trinity worked in the maze of underground corridors that had become their surgical ward, triaging the wounded by candlelight when the generators failed. "This one first," Margaret called, kneeling beside a young boy whose leg was badly crushed. "Dorothy, I need—" "Already here." Dorothy appeared with the morphine and bandages before Margaret finished speaking. Elizabeth was 3 beds down, working on a woman with severe abdominal injuries. "Dr. Harrison, I need you here immediately. She's hemorrhaging internally." The doctor arrived within seconds, and together they managed to stabilize the patient long enough to get her surgery. As Elizabeth stepped back, letting the surgical team take over, she caught sight of a man standing in the shadows, watching them with intense interest. He was tall, perhaps in his 50s, wearing a well-cut suit despite the chaos around him. His face was vaguely familiar, though Elizabeth couldn't place him. When he noticed her looking, he quickly turned away and disappeared into the crowd of walking wounded and volunteers. "Did you see that man?" she asked Margaret later, during a brief respite. "What man?" "Never mind. I'm probably just exhausted." But she saw him again 2 nights later, and this time Dorothy noticed him too. "That's odd," Dorothy said. "He's not injured, and he doesn't look like he's here to help. He's just watching us." It was Sister Matthews who finally provided an answer. She called the 3 of them into her office after their shift, her expression troubled. "I don't know how to tell you this gently, so I'll be direct. That man you've noticed has been making inquiries about you. All 3 of you. His name is Thomas Ashford, and he claims to be a cousin of your mother's family." The sisters exchanged glances. They'd told no one about their discovery, carefully maintaining their separate surnames and histories. "Our mother," Elizabeth said carefully. Sister Matthews sighed. "I've been a nurse for 30 years, girls. I noticed things. The way you 3 work together, the identical birthdays, the way you've become inseparable. I have my suspicions. And when Mr. Ashford started asking questions, I did some investigating of my own." She pulled out a file from her desk. "Your triplets separated at birth. Catherine Hartwell was your mother. I found the records." Margaret felt her world tilting again. "How long have you known?" "Only a few weeks. I wasn't sure whether to tell you, but now that this man has appeared." She shook her head. "He says the family wants to meet you. All of you. Apparently, they've been looking for you for years, trying to undo the damage that was done." "Why now?" Elizabeth's voice was sharp with suspicion. 25 years later, why would they suddenly care? "He says Catherine left a letter, to be opened on your 25th birthday. They found it after Robert Hartwell died last month." Elizabeth's face went white. "My father, my uncle, is dead?" Sister Matthews nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry, but apparently the letter changed everything. Your mother wrote about her 3 daughters, about the coercion she faced, about her dying wish that you 3 be reunited. The family is consumed with guilt and wants to make amends." Dorothy stood abruptly. "Make amends? They stole our childhood, our chance to know each other, our mother's love. They scattered us like we were shameful secrets to be hidden away. And now they want to make amends." "I understand your anger," Sister Matthews said, "but Mr. Ashford seems genuine. He's arranged for them to meet you, if you're willing. There's apparently a trust fund, established by your mother before her death, that's been growing for 25 years. It belongs to the 3 of you." Margaret felt numb. Money? They wanted to offer them money as compensation for stolen sisterhood? But Elizabeth surprised her. "We'll meet them," she said firmly, "not for their absolution or their money, but because we deserve to hear the truth, the whole truth, about what happened to our mother and why." Catherine's letter. The Hartwell family solicitor's office in Mayfair seemed obscenely comfortable compared to the bombed-out ruins that surrounded it. Crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead. Persian rugs cushioned their feet, and oil paintings in gilt frames lined the walls, a pocket of privilege untouched by the war that raged outside. Thomas Ashford rose as they entered, and Margaret immediately saw the family resemblance. He had Catherine's eyes, the same eyes that looked back at her from the mirror each morning. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your mother's cousin. I was 16 when she died, and I've carried the guilt of my silence for 25 years. 4 other people sat in the room, elderly aunts and uncles whose names blurred together in Margaret's mind. They all looked uncomfortable, privileged people forced to confront the consequences of their actions. We've prepared statements. One of the aunts began, but Elizabeth cut her off. We don't want your statements or your apologies. We want the truth, all of it, and we want to read our mother's letter. The solicitor, a thin man named Mr. Pembroke, cleared his throat. Yes, of course. The letter is why we've gathered you here. He pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax. Catherine Hartwell wrote this 3 days before her death, stipulating that it should be given to her 3 daughters on their 25th birthday, should they ever be found. He handed the envelope to Elizabeth, whose hands trembled as she broke the seal. Margaret and Dorothy moved to flank her, reading over her shoulders as she unfolded the pages covered in delicate handwriting. My dearest daughters, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and I pray that you have found each other. I have fought with every breath to keep you with me, but I am dying, and they have won. In a few days, you will be taken from me and scattered, and I will not be here to protect you. I want you to know that you were not conceived in shame, but in love. Your father was a soldier, brave and kind, who died at the Somme before I could tell him about you. When I learned I was carrying triplets, I was frightened but also filled with wonder. 3 perfect souls growing inside me, 3 daughters I would love with every fiber of my being. My family has called you a scandal, a disgrace. They have forced me to agree to give you up, threatened to have me committed to an asylum if I resist. They say they will place you in good homes, but they insist you must be separated. They claim it is for your own good, that 3 babies at once would be too difficult, that you will have better lives apart. I know this is a lie. I have seen you together in my arms these past 3 days. Even now, so tiny and new, you reach for each other. When one cries, the others respond. You are connected in ways I cannot explain, 3 souls that share one essence. Margaret, my firstborn by 3 minutes, you have your father's strength. Even in these few days, I see it in the determined way you grasp my finger in your steady gaze. Dorothy, my middle child, you have inherited my stubbornness. You fight the nurses when they try to take you from your sisters, wailing until you are reunited. Elizabeth, my youngest, you are the calm one, the observer. But I see a fierce intelligence in your eyes that will serve you well. They tell me you will not remember me, that infants retain no memories of their first days. Perhaps they are right, but I hope some part of you will remember your sisters, will feel the emptiness of their absence, will search for what was stolen from you. I have established a trust with what little money I have, overseen by our solicitor, Mr. Pembroke. He alone knows the truth and has promised to help you find each other when you turn 25. I pray he keeps his word. Know this, my beloved daughters. You are wanted. You are loved. And the separation that has been forced upon you is not of your making or mine. It is the product of fear, of narrow minds and cruel conventions. Do not let it define you. Do not let it make you bitter. Find each other. Love each other. Forgive me for being too weak to save you. Your mother, Catherine. By the time they finished reading, all 3 were crying openly. The Hartwell relatives looked away, unable to meet their eyes. She fought for us, Dorothy whispered. Even dying, she fought. Thomas Ashford spoke, his own eyes wet. She did more than fight. She refused food, hoping it would buy her time. She wrote letters to everyone she knew, begging for help. She tried to escape the hospital twice with you 3 in her arms. The family had guards posted to prevent it. You knew all this, Margaret said, her voice dangerous. All of you knew, and you did nothing. We were cowards, Thomas said simply. I was young, but that's no excuse. The others. He gestured at the elderly relatives. They believed they were protecting the family name, acting in everyone's best interest. They've lived with the guilt ever since. Not enough guilt to come find us, Elizabeth said coldly. We tried. One of the uncles protested weakly. After Robert died, and we found the letter, we hired investigators. But the adoption records were sealed, and the agency had burned down during the Blitz. We thought you were lost forever. Then Thomas saw you at the hospital. He recognized Catherine in your faces, and when he learned there were 3 of you, all the same age. We want nothing from you. Elizabeth stood, her composure returned. No money, no belated family connections, no absolution for your consciences. We have each other now, which is all our mother wanted for us. You can keep your guilt. It's the only inheritance we'll accept from the Hartwell family. They turned to leave, but Mr. Pembroke stopped them. Please, there's one more thing. Your mother's trust has grown considerably. It's worth nearly £50,000. She wanted you to have it, to have the opportunities she never did. £50,000. In 1941, it was a fortune. They could quit the hospital, live comfortably for years, perhaps forever. The 3 sisters looked at each other, and in that glance, they all knew. Donate it, Margaret said, to St. Mary's Hospital, for supplies, equipment, whatever they need most. Our mother saved our lives by fighting for us. We'll honor her by saving others. As they walked out into the London evening, air raid sirens already beginning their nightly song, they held hands, 3 sisters reunited, carrying their mother's love forward into a world at war. The darkest hour, summer of 1942, brought no relief from the war. If anything, the conflict had intensified, spreading across continents while London continued to endure sporadic but devastating air raids. St. Mary's Hospital, strengthened by the unexpected donation from the Hartwell Trust, had expanded its underground operations and saved countless lives. The Trinity had become more than local legends. Newspapers had picked up their story, though not the full truth. 3 nurses' aides save hundreds. Read the headline in the Times, accompanied by a photograph of Margaret, Dorothy, and Elizabeth standing together in front of the hospital. The article praised their selfless dedication and extraordinary teamwork, but made no mention of their sisterhood. That secret they kept carefully guarded, not from shame, but from a desire to protect the one precious thing that was truly theirs. Dorothy's husband James had been killed in action at Tobruk in January. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning, and she'd read it silently before tucking it into her pocket and returning to work. It wasn't until her shift ended 12 hours later that she'd collapsed in their flat, finally allowing herself to grieve. Margaret and Elizabeth had held her through the night, the 3 of them tangled together like they must have been as infants, finding comfort in the physical connection they'd been denied for so long. He never knew about you two, Dorothy had said at one point, her voice raw from crying. I wanted to tell him, but it felt too complicated to explain in letters. Now he'll never know that his wife had sisters. He knew you were loved, Margaret had said firmly. That's what matters. The war ground on. They saved who they could and mourned those they couldn't. Each life lost felt personal now. Each success a small victory against the darkness. The work was exhausting, often heartbreaking, but they had each other, and that made it bearable. It was a humid August night when everything changed. The raid began like dozens of others. Sirens, the distant crump of explosions, the steady arrival of casualties. But this time, the bombs fell closer than usual, and one struck the building directly above their underground ward. The ceiling collapsed in a shower of brick and plaster. Margaret saw it happening as if in slow motion, the cracks spreading across the reinforced concrete, the first chunks beginning to fall, Dorothy directly beneath the collapse point. She dove without thinking, tackling her sister and rolling them both clear just as a massive beam crashed down where Dorothy had been standing. They landed hard, Margaret's shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, pain exploding through her chest. Margaret, Elizabeth was there instantly, her hands already assessing for injuries. Don't move. Your shoulder's dislocated, and I think you've broken ribs. The ward had erupted into chaos. Part of the ceiling had come down, injuring 3 patients and blocking one of the exits. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, and somewhere in the darkness, someone was screaming. I'm fine, Margaret gasped, though she very clearly wasn't. Help the others. Absolutely not, Elizabeth said firmly. Dorothy, get Dr. Harrison. Tell him we need to evacuate this section immediately. Margaret, I'm going to reset your shoulder. This is going to hurt. It did hurt, an explosion of white-hot agony that made Margaret's vision go black at the edges. But then the joint was back in place, and Elizabeth was wrapping her ribs with swift, efficient movements. "You saved my life," Dorothy said, her face pale in the emergency lighting. "That beam would have killed me." "You'd have done the same," Margaret managed, though breathing was difficult. "They would have done the same." That was the truth of what they'd become. Three women so intertwined that self-preservation extended to each other without thought or hesitation. The evacuation took 3 hours. They moved patients through partially collapsed corridors, Dr. Harrison and Sister Matthews directing the operation while the Trinity worked despite Margaret's injuries. When the last patient had been moved to safety, Margaret finally allowed herself to collapse. She woke in a hospital bed, a strange reversal, with Dorothy and Elizabeth sitting on either side of her. "You've been asleep for 16 hours, Elizabeth informed her. 2 broken ribs, dislocated shoulder, mild concussion, and severe exhaustion. Dr. Harrison says you're to remain in bed for at least a week." "A week?" Margaret tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "We can't afford." "We can afford it," Dorothy interrupted gently. "The hospital can spare us for a few days. Sister Matthews has already arranged for extra staff." Margaret settled back against the pillows, feeling tears prick her eyes. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, leaving only bone-deep exhaustion and the overwhelming realization of how close they'd come to losing each other. "I can't do this without you," she whispered. "Either of you. When I saw that ceiling collapsing, I didn't think. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to you." Elizabeth took her hand. "We're sisters, Margaret. We protect each other. That's what we do. But what if next time I'm not fast enough? What if?" "Then we face it together," Dorothy said firmly. "We've already lost 23 years. We're not losing any more time to fear. Our mother fought for us until her last breath. The least we can do is honor that by living fully, loving fiercely, and saving every life we can." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared purpose settling around them like a mantle. "Did you ever wonder," Margaret said quietly, "what our lives would have been like if they kept us together? If Catherine had lived, or if someone had shown courage enough to defy convention?" "Every day," Elizabeth admitted. "But then I think about the lives we've saved precisely because we found each other. 3 separate women might have become nurses, might have been competent and dedicated. But the 3 of us together? We're something more. Our connection makes us better, stronger, more effective. Perhaps that's why we found each other when we did," Dorothy mused. "Not when we were children who needed raising, but when we were adults who could make a difference. Perhaps Catherine's fight, her sacrifice, was meant to lead us here, to this work, to this moment." It was a comforting thought, though Margaret suspected the truth was far more random and cruel. But if believing their separation had meaning helped them endure, then she would choose to believe it too. "When I'm healed," Margaret said, "we keep going. We save as many as we can, for as long as we can." "Agreed, agreed," her sisters answered in unison. Outside the window, the sun was rising over London, illuminating a city that refused to surrender despite everything thrown at it. The war would continue. People would keep dying. But 3 sisters, reunited against all odds, would stand together against the darkness, saving hundreds without most of them ever knowing the extraordinary story behind the Trinity. Legacy. The war ended in May 1945, but the Trinity continued their work at St. Mary's Hospital for decades after. They became an institution, 3 women who seemed to age at the same rate, their connection deepening rather than diminishing with time. By 1965, they were in their late 40s, no longer the young women who had worked frantically through the Blitz, but respected senior nurses whose reputation had spread throughout Britain's medical community. They trained hundreds of young nurses and saved thousands of lives. Yet they never revealed their secret, maintaining separate surnames and carefully constructed histories. It was Dr. Harrison, retired now, but still visiting occasionally, who finally confronted them. "I've known for years," he said one afternoon, cornering them in the staff room. "I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. Triplets, aren't you? Separated at birth, reunited by chance during the war. They looked at each other, and Margaret found herself smiling. "Yes," she said simply, "but we'd appreciate if you kept that to yourself." "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "It's an extraordinary story. Imagine the inspiration it could provide, the hope it might give to others." Elizabeth shook her head. "Because it's ours. Our story, our secret, our connection. The war made so many things public, turned personal tragedies into headlines and statistics. This is the one thing we've kept private, and we'd like to keep it that way." "Fair enough," Dr. Harrison said. "But you should know, you three have saved more lives than any other medical team I've ever worked with. Your connection, whatever its source, has been a gift to everyone who's passed through these doors." They retired in 1971, all on the same day, leaving together as they'd worked together for 32 years. The hospital held a ceremony, speeches were made, awards presented. But what mattered to the three sisters was the simple fact that they'd done it. They'd honored Catherine's sacrifice by living lives of purpose and meaning. They bought a cottage in Sussex, not far from the orphanage where Margaret had grown up. They'd found it together, fallen in love with the garden and the light streaming through the windows, the sense of peace after decades of intensity. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Dorothy asked one evening, the three of them sitting in the garden watching the sunset. "Our mother." Margaret considered. "Yes, I think she'd be proud we found each other, proud we never let them separate us again once we knew the truth." "We should write it down," Elizabeth said suddenly. "Not for publication, but for the record, so that someday someone will know the truth about Catherine Hartwell and her three daughters." They spent the next year compiling their story, document from the adoption agency, Catherine's letter which they'd kept carefully preserved, their own journals and memories from the war years. They created a complete record of their separation and reunion, sealed it, and donated it to the Imperial War Museum with instructions that it be opened in 2045, 100 years after the war's end. "Let them know," Margaret wrote in the accompanying note, "that out of tragedy and shame came something beautiful. Three sisters who saved hundreds of lives, who never gave up on each other, even when they didn't know each other existed. Let them know that Catherine Hartwell's love transcended death and time, that her fight to keep her daughters together ultimately succeeded, just not in the way she imagined. They lived together in that Sussex cottage for 20 more years, three elderly women who finished each other's sentences and knew each other's thoughts. The villagers thought they were peculiar but harmless, retired nurses who'd worked together so long they'd become inseparable. Elizabeth died first, in 1991, peacefully in her sleep. Margaret and Dorothy found her in the morning, curled on her side in the pose they'd all slept in as infants, according to Catherine's descriptions. They buried her in the village churchyard, under a stone that read, "Sister, Nurse, Hero." Dorothy followed 2 years later, her heart simply giving out one spring morning. Margaret held her hand as she went, whispering the things that sisters say to each other. Promises to remember, assurances of love, gratitude for every shared moment. Margaret lived 5 more years alone, the first time she'd been truly solitary since 1939. She spent those years organizing their papers, ensuring their story would be preserved, writing letters to nieces and nephews explaining the truth about their family history. When she died in 1998, at the age of 82, the vicar who conducted her funeral noted that she was smiling, as if meeting old friends. The three sisters were buried together, their headstones simple. Margaret Walsh Dorothy Chin Elizabeth Hartwell, 1916 to 1998, 1916 to 1993, 1916 to 1991 sisters in blood and spirit together at last. The document was opened at the Imperial War Museum in 2045, exactly 100 years after VE Day. The curator, who read it, wept, then immediately contacted historians and journalists. The story of the Trinity, 3 British nurses' aides who had saved hundreds during the war without ever knowing they were sisters until chance brought them together, captured the public imagination. Books were written, documentaries produced, schools named in their honor. But the real legacy wasn't in the accolades or recognition. It was in the lives they'd saved, the nurses they'd trained, the example they'd set of what determination, love, and an unbreakable bond could accomplish. In the museum, next to Catherine's letter and the sisters' own accounts, hung a photograph from 1945, three women in nurses' uniforms, arms around each other, smiling despite the exhaustion evident in their faces. They looked alike, but that wasn't what drew visitors' attention. It was something in their expressions, a contentment and completeness that transcended the war-torn world around them. Three sisters, separated by shame and convention, reunited by war, who spent their lives proving that love, whether recognized or hidden, spoken or silent, was the strongest force in a world determined to tear people apart. Their mother's letter ended with a hope. Find each other. Love each other. They did both, and in doing so, they saved not just hundreds of lives, but themselves.